Sandy Blaine is an author, an expert wellness consultant whose work draws on the, wait for it, science of positive psychology. And that being, of course, to listeners of this show, you know, the science of happiness and what it means to have a meaningful life. And she does that work in conjunction with her background in wellness, in mind-body integration, and she uses those tools to help people realize their highest potential and create well-being, fulfillment, happiness, all those things that we are about. That storied and interesting career includes working with Pixar in their in-house wellness program since 1994, which when I read that on your website, I thought, like, wow, how long was that before your average corporate workplace was talking about wellness? And now we're in this world where everyone is talking about wellness. She's got multiple books on yoga. She's written for the Huffington Post, Yoga International, Ascent Magazine, Yoga Journal. She's been teaching yoga or teaching yoga teachers in combination for 35 years. Is that she's like,
but almost 30.
Okay. I don't know why I thought it 35. Sure. Yeah. 30. Cool. So it's obvious to say that Sandy's got a lot to offer, and I'm excited to have her on the show. This is our first time on the show. It certainly will not be the last. But I'm excited to say, welcome to Better Than Fine.
Thank you, Darlene. I'm a fan of the show, so I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, I love it. I love the circle back.
Yeah, lots of synergy between our work and our interests and our points of view. So,
and also just you're a kind and interesting person that I'm happy to have in my circle of people, right?
Well, thank you. Likewise.
Thank you. So we planned to do an episode many months from now. We talked about doing an episode when the book that you're currently working on comes out. But while having just kind of a sidebar conversation, you shared with me your own reflections on the concept of discipline. And it's something that I'd been thinking about lately anyway. So we're going to have a very different kind of show today than the average listeners probably used to, because it's less of like a structured interview. It's not me just waxing poetic on a topic. It's more of us having a conversation around this idea of discipline as being this key to success as it's promoted out in the achievement world. So I just want to set up that both of us have people in our lives who comment on like, oh, you have so much discipline because you eat a certain way and you move a certain way and you practice your mindfulness or whatever it is. So whether we're talking about getting up early to meditate, or we're talking about carving the time to, in my case, lift a lot, that we don't necessarily agree with that framing. So you want to pick it up there and share like how you came to this conversation?
Well, yeah. Because I have done yoga for so long and so regularly, I do get that comment of, oh, you're so disciplined, which I know is not true, and people who are close to me would never characterize me that way. And I've always replied, not really. What I am is highly motivated. And so I have been interested in that idea. There were several key ideas that drew me to positive psychology. And when I did start studying positive psychology, which is another story that we can talk about, but I was really delighted to find all of the research that had been done on various topics that I'd become interested in out of my own experience, or that really described my own experience. But in much more developed and nuanced ways. It gave me language to speak about it, but also really deepened my understanding of those ideas. And one of those things was all of the research that's been done about human motivation and the different kinds of motivation. And that spoke to exactly what I've been telling people for years, that intrinsic motivation is just more positive and more effective than this idea of rigid self-discipline. And two things that I would say about that are, one, you do find this idea of self-discipline in positive psychology. You do find people saying, oh, self-regulation is the top strength because it supports all the other strengths. And, no doubt there are days where I think, wow, I could do with some more self-regulation, and even more with the, even more during the pandemic when I found it much more challenging to stick to any kind of schedule. But yet, doing something consistently for the joy of it is, for me, a happier approach and a little bit more in line with my ideas about positive psychology and the science of well-being. And I just feel like there's a split there between well-being and achievement. And, there are ways that they intersect, but your happiest days are not days that you march through life with perfect self-discipline on a schedule, adhering, right?
Hold up. I need to back up.
Yeah.
Because since you said it, I've just been like sitting here stewing, mentally stewing, not like anger stewing. Is there a difference between self-regulation and discipline?
There are probably some nuances there. I mean, what do you think?
I immediately was like thinking about times. All right. So when I think of self-regulation, I think of like, what's my knee-jerk reaction and how am I, and is it really how I feel or is it really how I control? So when I think particularly about self-regulation, I think of like when my man person has done something that has really ticked me off and I want to just like tell him off right in that second, but I don't, because I know that one, it's not productive. Two, it's not like really who I am and probably not actually how I feel. It's probably just like, but I catch myself, which to me is not the same as if I think of self-discipline, I think of in my late 20s as like a baby trainer in this famous gym in the West Village, where it's like all the sexy people. And I feel like, oh, I don't fit in here. So let me do these very extreme workouts and these extreme diets and adhere to them to the letter so that I can be accepted in this environment. That was discipline. And it was a reward structure that I'd internalized around reward and punishment.
Yeah.
Which is not to me the same as catching myself in a behavior that I want to change because I know that that's not who I want to be as a partner. Right? That's very aligned, which wouldn't be, we're about to go down a different rabbit hole, but you mentioned intrinsic, extrinsic. And I want to unpack that, but first I want to give you a chance to just respond to like, to me, those are different, self-regulation and discipline.
Yes, you make a very good point. So what you're talking about and what is often meant by self-regulation is emotional self-regulation, right? It's emotional intelligence. And actually, now that you say that, I think, well, some people are talking about that in positive psychology when they talk about self-regulation. Like that is one huge area of self-regulation, but there's also the self-regulation that's related to like there's a spectrum of self-regulation that's related to habits, right? That's really related to habits. So there's kind of a spectrum of self-regulation, discipline, willpower, right? And all of those things that can work together or not. But I also have a knee-jerk resistance when I do hear of discipline, self-discipline, willpower as the basis of behavior. I mean,
it's just
one
fragile.
thing is, yes, exactly. One thing is the research is willpower just doesn't work, right?
Yeah,
it doesn't work. And again, I feel like even on days where you feel like, wow, my willpower is really strong today, are those your happiest days? Like marching through your day with this kind of self-discipline and getting everything checked off on your to-do list.
But it's so like, I think of when you talk about this spectrum, right? It's like, okay, willpower is the marshmallow experiment. You know that eventually you get to give in. Discipline is I'm going through boot camp and I know boot camp is eventually over. Self-regulation is I'm choosing to be someone else. And so I'm going to keep reinvesting in the lessons and the control of creating new habits that align better with who I want to be when I grow up. Right. And so even if we're talking about habit change, like there was a period in my life that I was a smoker and I really liked smoking. And there are times now that I still think, God, I wish it wouldn't just kill me because I liked the social component. I liked the little buzz it gave me. I didn't like the throat infections I kept getting, but it took me years to quit because I didn't really want to. And so I was relying on willpower and discipline attached to the negative associations of what would happen to me if I kept smoking, for obvious health risks. But this was at a time that I wasn't a trainer. I was not very healthy anyway. I had bad mental health practices to begin with. Like there was a lot going on. It was not until I became a trainer and my identity changed. And I actually understood that every time I had a cigarette, I was giving myself mild carbon monoxide poisoning and it would mess with my workouts. That's what finally changed it for me, right? Because now it aligns with what I can use as self-regulation to enhance my desire to change towards something I want, which is like, we still need to unpack intrinsic, extrinsic, but it's more aligned with identity, which is still extrinsic. It's not done purely for pleasure and joy, but it is at least closer on the spectrum to the things you want to do, as opposed to the stuff you're making yourself do.
Right.
That's my argument.
It's a great argument. I think that is the key thing. You touched on the key thing. You didn't really want to. If you don't really want to, and it comes from, outside, if it comes, you've talked about the shoulds, and I've always said, yeah, I'm not a fan of the word should. It's been a mantra
shouldn't all over yourself.
Right, exactly. If you don't really want to, it's not, does that really support your well-being, in a holistic way? Yeah. Right. And that, so a lot of my experience was organic. I fell in love with yoga. I did yoga very regularly from almost the time that I discovered it. It was really just a source of joy and well-being for me. And it did then intrinsically change some of my other behaviors and habits. When you're doing something for the love of it and it nourishes you so much, you do tend to gravitate toward healthier behaviors in other ways, right? It just, that all sort of can come naturally. So I'm big fan of finding your joy and having things radiate from there.
Yeah. So. Well, and I guess this is why I wanted to unpack intrinsic versus extrinsic, right? So intrinsic is when we do things purely for the pleasure of them, right? You find your joy and you love it there and you do it because you enjoy it. On the other end, we have complete amotivation. It's like, I'm not going to do that shit. Like I didn't want to quit smoking. It's so awful, right? As a fitness professional, be like, but it's honest. It's honest.
And I have a major sweet tooth, which actually I just brag about because I don't like, because I really want to own it. I just don't ever want to be inauthentic with that. So, if you love smoking, there you go. I do want to just circle back to one thing you said, intrinsic motivation. Yes, it's something you do for the joy of it or because it's deeply meaningful for you, right? I think that meaning can trigger our intrinsic motivation.
Well, all right. So my understanding was, and maybe this is an opportunity for me to learn some things, which is always welcome. We've got this spectrum, right, between intrinsic and amotivation. So our fully external motivation is like systems of reward and punishment, right? Like I don't jaywalk in Los Angeles because I'm going to get a ticket. I'm not going to get a ticket in New York. So screw it. I'm walking where I want, right? Like there's no punishment for it. Or my boss is motivating me with bonuses. I'm going to work an extra couple of days to get the bonuses, even though I don't want to work, right? Those are all external. If we internalize them, right? And now I'm trying to think of, that's introjected, right? We internalize those systems of reward and punishment. That's me wanting to fit in at the gym. And so I'm going to do these extreme diets because I think I should look a certain way. And then of course my physiology doesn't work that way and it ends up backfiring, but that's a different story for a different episode. Now I thought, and of course my brain is escaping me on these next two stops along the line here, that things that we deeply value or we deeply identify with. So like identified regulation is the closest one to intrinsic. That's where we see it as part of our identities. But I thought things that we find valuable, deeply valued and meaningful, were like, okay, I'm not doing this for the joy of it, but I'm still going to do it. And it's still important to me. Am I incorrect in that understanding?
I think it's more that there's a Venn diagram, right?
Okay.
Where those two things overlap. Yeah, no, I don't think you're incorrect. But
I'm
there is
thinking
a
of
Venn
Ryan and
diagram.
Deci make it look like a spectrum. And so
Yeah,
for the uninitiated, Ryan and Deci created the
there certainly is a
self-determination theory.
spectrum. But I think when we get to that, there's
Yeah,
that overlap between what's meaningful and what's joyful,
I
right?
dig
And
that.
then, yeah,
I dig that.
yeah.
But I think where we're of like mind in this is that motivation in the way that we're talking about it, discipline kind of falls on that really externalized reward and punishment end of the spectrum. And I think also is important if we're being mindful of our audience is to like recognize that the way we talk to ourselves about these things decides where it falls on the line.
Yes, that's very true. And I'm thinking of a really close friend of mine who's not a body-oriented person and has said to me sometimes, having a bad day, did 15 minutes of yoga, and just her astonishment of like, really, I feel that much, like I feel hugely better. Like, how can I feel this much better? I mean, and then you experience that is going to become over time intrinsic motivation, right? Right. Even though you started it from a should, but you experience that. Whereas you're doing it for the extra money, right? Or the societal approval, that really probably is never going to transform into intrinsic motivation, right? Because you're always going for that next thing.
I feel like unless you've had some kind of self-transcendent epiphany experience, right? Like you were a trainer, you're doing extra training sessions for the money, you're not deeply identified with like, I don't know, whatever, this new client. And then it turns out this client is, in desperate need of your help. And they're so grateful that you absorb some of that and reflect it back to them. And then it becomes about that person and not about that money. Right. But in that circumstance, it really is the message you tell yourself. Am I working this late in the day because I have to, or I choose to because this other stuff, right? Like this is the core of that reframe that I know I've talked about on the show a bunch because it's important.
Right. The reframing. Absolutely. And, I mean, as people who are teachers, instructors, people who work with clients, some of where you find your meaning and your joy and your intrinsic motivation is the caring you have for those people and your ability to positively impact their lives. I mean, that really is, one of the core things that makes a good teacher is it's about them and not about you, right? So
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's you talk about Venn diagrams. It's like the sweet spot of this body of evidence or technique or whatever role that I feel really passionate about, this modality. And it's the ability to impact someone's life and how can those fit together in a way that feels good for everybody involved. And also I feel like as a student, you can really tell when that person isn't there for those reasons, right? And it does change your experience. And my advice to that person is find a new teacher, but it makes a big difference.
And you can tell when they are, right? You can tell when they are and feel that authentic connection with that person. And, when I actually started teaching yoga, I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. I actually started teaching when I was in college and at Berkeley, and which is also where I grew up. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I was like, well, what I really love is yoga, but yoga itself, the practice of yoga is an internal experience. And I wouldn't have predicted that I would love teaching as much as I do, because that's just a very different thing than being on your own mat and doing your own yoga. But I just found that exactly what you said, the ability to positively impact people's lives and to share my joy and the well-being of that practice was very fulfilling.
Can you think of any particular moment or moments where this like kind of epiphany that it seems like we have both had about motivation was obvious to you? Because my moment was like right before we had that conversation. Like you said the words and I'm like, shut up, Sandy. Like I just had this thought yesterday.
Oh gosh, I've been teaching for so long. So all along the way, just the sort of feedback from people of wow, I feel so much better. And one of my teacher training students said, because I did teacher training for a really long time, well, for like 15 years. And I stopped shortly before I came to grad school. I kind of took a leave of absence from that and then moved on to other things. But I loved doing teacher training. And one person said to me that what she saw me modeling, that she was trying to emulate, was both the joy that I had in the practice, but also this message that I gave to students of, you can do this, right? You can do this. She said, I just watched you. It's like, you could do it. And you were telling people, you can do this. You can learn it, to break it down into little bites, and you can expand your limits. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's really like a wonderful description of what I want to be putting out there.
Yeah. And I imagine that it is not this like toxic positivity, hollow wellness thing of like, you can do anything. It's like, no, anything can be broken down into requisite skill sets. And
Right.
we can put this into bite-sized chunks that you can metabolize. And then you put those chunks together. And then, yes, you can figure this out. Right. Which is a very different tone of belief. Right.
Well, and in terms of yoga poses, yes, it's never, oh, you can definitely get to this, advanced pose. That's really not the important part of it. It's, you can get to the next step, and working on this next step is going to have all these benefits. And it doesn't matter what 3 steps down the line is.
Right. And that's not really the point, right? When we're talking about yoga specifically. And I think of it even from a like movement and training perspective, right? The goal for me is never to get some client who's like competing in Olympic lifting at a national level. Like I'm not that coach. You shouldn't be with me. But like, if you're, I don't know, struggling to function because your movement quality is compromised and you think that you can't get better, well, yeah, you can do it. Let's find the way, like, let's break it down to the component parts.
Right. And the goal is just to discover more well-being in your body. That's
right. Yes.
Right.
Yes. I want to find a way to call it a different word than what like some of our fellow practitioners use the same words that we do to call their thing. It's like, this is a different thing. There's a different intention behind it.
Yeah.
So I guess, when I think about this discipline motivation thing, I used to not recoil to discipline because like baby trainer Darlene thought that, no, discipline's how you get this. And then I learned some hard lessons. And now when I think about discipline, I had a pretty militant first stepdad, former drill sergeant, cop, and like that house was run like a barracks. And there was a lot of expectations that came with that. And I hated it and definitely rejected it as a life model. And when I think about discipline, I think about what he thought he was teaching us, my brothers and I, and really what he taught us was the opposite. Whereas opposed to like my own dad, who I can think of like teaching me how to change the tires on my car and like car maintenance, which is like a very routine thing. But, he was able to make it matter to me. And that's the valued piece. And I think of that as like, oh, I'm motivated to spend time with my dad and to also like make sure my car doesn't break down on the side of the road. Right. Like it doesn't have to be like, I'm motivated because this is so fun. It can also be like, I'm motivated because there's, like value in caring about something.
Right. And it is a form of self-care as well.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Caring for yourself. Yeah. So let's assume that hopefully we've convinced some listeners that they care about motivation more, but they're like, yeah, Sandy, what do I do about this? I'm still not making myself get up at 6 a.m. to meditate or whatever.
Yes. Well, making yourself do something is a should. And many people will tend to either rebel against that, right? The automatic sort of rebellion against that. But even those who don't, it's not necessarily like a happy or fulfilling experience. If you're not a morning person, I mean, my thing would be, I would say, instead of I'm going to get up at 6 a.m. to meditate every day, I would say, what is the best time of day for me to meditate? Where can I fit it into my schedule that really works with my natural rhythm? So I actually do try to, and I do this some days and not others, but I try and practice first thing. Like whenever I get up, I try and practice first thing before I plug in, and then take my meditation. I'll meditate for a few minutes after my yoga practice, but I try and take a wellness and self-care break. And it depends on the season, actually, what time. Like at this time of year, it'd be 3:30, 4 o'clock, right? Toward the end of the day, but not dark out yet. So in the summer, I have a longer work day. I also have, a little more control over my work schedule than maybe the average person. But I think you can still, even if with a regular job, take a wellness and self-care break mid-afternoon. And that is then either meditation, go for a walk, a cardio break. It kind of depends on what I need that day.
Ooh, that I think is an important one to highlight too, as a practitioner, is I think there is value in like, okay, I'm going to consistently do a specific practice for a certain amount of time in order to internalize it, understand it, like deepen it, whatever. But at a certain point, it's not about how many days in a row I've done, metta, like loving kindness meditation. It's really like, okay, that's not really what I need today. What I need today is a mindful walk. Like I need to move, and sitting is only going to make whatever state I'm feeling more agitated or whatever. Like what I actually need is this other thing. And being able to read oneself and have a library to pull from to connect to that need and move through it and with it. Because I just think there's an assumption that like, oh, well, you probably meditate every day and you do this specific kind of meditation, and that's the best kind of meditation because you've been doing this, for decades. And like, I at least for me, it's not really like that.
Right. And I like that. You said library. I think of it as toolbox, but having your own personal wellness or well-being library or toolbox that you can tap into. When the pandemic started, I thought, okay, well, my yoga practice, and I know I did keep up my yoga practice. It depended on the day and the week, but it certainly was a source of well-being and nourishment for me. But I really found that my most reliable mental health boost during this time was to get outside, go for a walk or a hike with a friend, mask, socially distance, but that sort of triple whammy well-being impact of social time, movement, outdoors time. The way that it was really astonishing how that could turn any day around during this time, very challenging time, right?
Oh yeah. I similarly, I read Joy of Movement in, during lockdown, because I was prepping to write my capstone, and Kelly's work is relevant to that. So for anybody who hasn't listened to the recent episode interviewing Kelly McGonigal, go listen to that if you want the quick version of her book.
Yeah, but, fans of Kelly McGonigal right here.
Yeah, right. We are the Kelly McGonigal fan club. Kelly, totally. I hope you're listening to this. Yeah. You're probably not, but a girl can dream. Anyway, so Kelly, so reading the book, I knew that my running practice was foundational to my well-being. I knew that it helped me be more productive, had a clearer head, like da 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 da. And then in Joy of Movement, she talks about like your endocannabinoid system and how it makes you more sensitive to serotonin and like all of these other elements, where I changed the duration and frequency of my runs through the COVID year, other than when I've been hurt or sick, because yay for having EDS, that these things happen. But I used to do, like one long run a week. Sometimes I'd get a second long in there, and I changed it to like every other day, 22 minutes. Because like, I just need to keep the sensitivity to anything positive as high as possible, to weather all of that. And so I do appreciate, like, just quick plug to understanding your own physiology at a level that you can tinker with these systems in the way that you're describing. It's like, okay, if I know that these are the cocktail elements that make me feel more positively human, let me start titrating that in and doing it because I want to have a happy, positive life, thereby tying the meaning to motivation instead of I should be moving more.
Well, right. And I actually, one of the friends that I walk with, this really close friend, she likes to do this staircase walk in her neighborhood. There's these staircases through Piedmont, which is adjacent to Oakland, that go up through the hills. And when I've done it, my phone says I've climbed 27 staircases when I do it. And she's like, do you want to do the butt burner staircase walk today? And I'm like, no. And honestly, no, like, no, I don't, but I'll do it because first of all, you want to do it. And second, I know I'll feel so great afterwards. And, and it does tick all those boxes. It's not really intrinsic motivation so much, right? But over time, I've seen it turn into intrinsic motivation because I'm like, wow, I really feel good after I do this.
But I think you bring up a really good point about how to hack that, because I think there's a lot of people out there who know, okay, I'll feel better if I get myself to that, but they struggle in the anticipatory moment of starting, right? But we know that because that last moment of something, right, is going to have an impression on us. If after doing the butt burner, you hit the top of that giant staircase and then you say to yourself, oh, I feel so much better, you're programming yourself to associate that positive feeling with the effort you just made. And by making those conscious associations, you're changing the narrative for yourself so that next time it's a little easier, a little easier, a little easier, a little easier.
Yeah. I mean, and that's her name for it. I don't even like the name for it, but boy, do I really like the effects. And it, again, it ticks all those boxes: outdoor, moving with a friend, and so social connection. And it's just like the friend I said who, like, wow, I cannot believe I feel that much better after a 15-minute yoga break, which I was resisting doing. Over time, that does turn into right. And there you have the upward spiral, right? The Barbara Fredrickson's upward spiral, which is so descriptive of my experience with yoga practice.
Which there is an episode on for anyone interested.
I'm like, wow, I feel amazing. I want to feel like this all the time. I'm going to do this again.
Well, I think there is, let me quick plug. I don't know that, like, if we're disambiguating motivation and discipline here, like maybe we don't call this discipline. But I think of times in my own life where I knew if I persisted, that feeling would come. And so I kept persisting and eventually got the physiological adaptation that allowed for the boost. Yeah. So I guess this is to say that if you are someone listening to this and you're like, yeah, but I don't feel that way when I do some of the things you're talking about, it's like, there may be a persistence component. There may be other things. I just got off a call with someone who I know listens to this show. So talking about like, why don't I exercise regularly? Like, I've tried all these different things. I don't like any of them. And once we dug in deep enough, it's like, oh, well, you have an injury. Every time you do them, you're in pain. Well, of course you don't like them. You're in pain. Let's either find stuff that isn't painful or address the underlying foundational stability issues so that you're not in as much pain. So there might be obstructions to people who are thinking like, well, this doesn't apply to me. Like, if we remove some constraints, you may find that you're able to access some of what we're talking about.
Right. I mean, actually, when I first found yoga, it was because I had knee injuries at a very young age. I had knee injuries, and I'm just genetically set up for them. And I am a natural movement and body person. I really hurt myself doing dance and gymnastics and stuff. And I kept doing yoga because it made me feel so great. And I actually enjoyed it. And even the parts of yoga that were really hard for me, I could feel how they were good for me. But then like 6 months in, my knee pain had cleared up, and that was tremendously motivating for me. So I did it not because I was interested in yoga, but because I was looking for something. Like, I first came to the class because I was looking for something that I could do that wouldn't hurt my knees or wouldn't injure them more. And that is how I came to it. But as a teacher, I saw this exactly what you're talking about. people would come, and if you're not a naturally flexible person and you start yoga in your 40s, right, there's a lot of sensation at first, a lot of sensation. And we do tend to be programmed to avoid intense sensation. And so if that's happening to you and you're a tight person, you're going to think, oh, I'm too tight to do yoga, or this doesn't feel good. And excuse me. And I saw time after time after time that for people who stuck with it for 6 weeks to 3 months, and that's a tall order. But the people who did stick with it for that certain period of time, there's a retraining that your nervous system experiences. You experience enough times of like, wow, that was hard or uncomfortable, but wow, I felt so much better afterwards. And then your nervous system starts to welcome that sensation. You learn the difference between sensation and pain. Yeah. Organically, you learn it. Intrinsically, you learn it. The difference between sensation and pain, and your whole system starts to welcome that sensation because you have that feedback loop of, wow, I feel better. This is healing. This is good. You learn the difference between sensation and pain, right?
Yeah.
Right. And there's actually an easy way to learn that difference, right? Which I would just say there's an easy way to learn that difference, which is, you stretch one side, right? You stretch one side. And I know most of people are listening to this in audio. So I just stretch my arm up over my head and drop my hand behind my head, and I'm lifting up one elbow, and maybe take 5 or 6 breaths, just really simple stretch. And then you drop, right? Yeah, let's do this.
I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to do it now, Sandy.
Yeah, do it. So one hand is dropped down
between your shoulder blades.
You're lifting that elbow up toward the ceiling. It's a kind of a universal feel good stretch. Don't do anything that hurts, right? Don't do anything that hurts. And take those deep breaths into that stretching side. One more deep breath, and then exhale and just let your arms drop back down. Feel your body. Okay, there's so much feedback, right? That's happening in your nervous system. All right, now, would it not feel so weird not to do the other side? Okay, would it not, is your body longing to do that other side, right?
Anyone who's in audio can't see me like wiggling.
Right. You are twitching to do that other side. But if somebody punched you in that arm, you would not be feeling like, I'm out of balance, right? I need somebody to punch me in the other arm.
Oh,
right?
That's fascinating. Okay, so what I hear you saying,
something that's not good for you.
What I hear you saying is that there's a sensation to the stretching, opening, elongation that you're like, oh, I think of it as self-myofascial release, right? If I roll one quad, I can't not roll the other quad.
Right.
Right. As opposed to, I immediately thought of get like jabbed with something because I'm thinking about my quads now. It's like if I get jabbed with something in one quad, I don't want it in the other quad.
You would have an aversion to that. And even things that you've never done before, like sometimes I teach yoga eye exercises. People have never done them before. And you do a diagonal, look up to one diagonal, down to the other diagonal, you pause. You are twitching to do that other, you are not going to feel in balance. So, right, the body craves balance, and you move toward things that are good for you and away in terms of sensation, not in terms of everything.
Okay.
But
so if we
do
tie
the other
this,
arm?
Sure, we can do the other arm. We'll do the other arm while we have this other, my thought is, if we tie this back to our theme, I think of motivation as getting punched in the arm. Where it's like, that didn't feel good. I don't want to do that again, but I'm going to make myself because it's quote unquote good for me, as opposed to finding a way to get the same outcome or to value it in a way that it becomes motivating. Right? Like some of that is meaning making.
Some of that is meaning making. That's right. And I think, so there we talk about our Venn diagram of even if it's not joyful at first, it's we're now more in balance. Stretching and breathing, and just a simple stretch, you feel better, right? Yeah. So, but to learn it without getting punched in the arm, there's that retraining. There's that retraining that happens if you stick with. I mean, yoga is my example, but with something because you feel better after. your whole system will learn to reinterpret. Yeah.
Well, and to add a button here, because we're coming to a close, I think we so often get these externalized labels of soft quotes healthy behavior, right? But when we're actually talking about wellness and well-being, we might be talking about the same behaviors, but we're talking about a different lens and approach to them.
And a different internal experience of them. And actually, since we are coming to a close, one thing that I did want to touch on in terms of the whole spectrum of motivation is Bob Valleran's work on passion, right? And that the difference, his studies on the difference in well-being impact when you have harmonious passion for something versus having obsessive passion. And we all know people who, they do it. They do that extreme diet, or they do the extreme exercise, but it runs them, right? Rather than being something that they, there's, again, that Venn diagram or overlap between intrinsic motivation and harmonious passion. And obsessive passion is, when you've gone so far down that self-discipline rabbit hole that whatever that behavior is sort of running you. It's not supporting your life. It's right. Your life is wrapped around it. And the well-being impact of that, it's diminishing returns on that in terms of well-being.
Yeah, I immediately think of the clients I've had who have overuse injuries in a recreational hobby sport, but aren't willing to even pause that sport for a few months in order to allow their body to heal.
Yeah.
And are grinding that joint into a fine paste or whatever. And it's like, okay, but you understand that if you keep going right now, you won't get to do that at all. And there will be other downstream negatives where there's a lot of other things you won't get to do, not even just that sport, but they're so, obsessive as to become a maladaptive, right?
Yes. I mean, something can be the center of your life because you love it, but if it is running your life and running your all of your mental narratives, then again, there's just diminishing returns to that.
What a wonderful wandering conversational experiment this has been. I want to thank you for coming on the show. I want to invite the listener to give us some feedback. Did we like this open format wander? What did we think? Because, we'll probably end up doing it again at some point.
I really hope so. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. Me too. All right.